So after the Trump administration shook the world by kidnapping Venezuela leader, an announcement from the Department of State in the United States came out that US citizens need to leave Venezuela as soon as possible because there are groups who support Maduro who are now looking for people who have US citizenship. Guess this is an act of revenge. Not only that they are looking for US citizens, but on top of that, they're looking for the traitor who betrayed the country by allowing the US to go in and kidnap Maduro. Now, keep in mind, the Trump administration told us that they are now running Venezuela, that nobody has anything to worry about, and that they will be sending a group of US citizens from the US government who will go to assess what needs to be done in Venezuela. Instead of hearing when they will be deployed there, we are hearing that US citizens have to run away from Venezuela. That's the first bad news we're hearing. The second news is that major oil companies in the United States are not interested in making big investment in Venezuela.
The plan is for them to spend, meaning our giant oil companies will be spending at least $100 billion of their money, not the government's money. They don't need government money.
We have a very long history in Venezuela. In fact, we first got into Venezuela back in the 1940s. We've had our assets seized there twice. And so you can imagine to re-enter a third time would require some pretty significant changes from what we've historically seen here and what is currently the state. If we look at the legal and commercial constructs and frameworks in place today in Venezuela, today it's uninvestable.
If you don't know, let me just remind you what happened here. The Trump administration in August of 2025, right? They moved every single thing you can imagine that is called military to surround Venezuela. From big ships and, drones and big armies and Delta forces and helicopters and, space stations and, anything else that you can imagine that has military on it. They surrounded Venezuela, right? And from August until January, they sat there, right? The superpower that they are, instead of just going in and taking over, right? In August, right? But they sat there from August all the way until January, begging to have at least one traitor in the army, one of the army leader, to invite the United States in so that they can go and take Maduro. For 4 months, that is what all those big, weapons coming from space and God and you name it, right? The biggest power on earth. They have the type of weapon we don't even know about. But for 4 months, they were incapable of just going in there and take Maduro and take him out. If you think about a superpower, the way they, tell their story of how they went in there, you would have thought that, well, why did he took 2 months to, to show this amount of power, right? And so finally, when they got invited into Venezuela, before going, they hired a Hollywood director who was going to film the entire thing for the media, so that they can tell this great story of deliverance, right? Coming from God himself, delivering the Venezuelan people from the devil Maduro. Went in there with the so-called Delta Force and all of that and did whatever they did. And then before leaving, they took, some of Venezuela's bodyguards who survived the attack to tell the great story of deliverance. So in social media, you've probably went across some videos of some, warmongers, cheap version of mainstream propaganda who's telling us this story. One of Maduro's bodyguard who survived the attack say that, when the U.S., forces went in there, it was like Zeus himself was going, lightning all over the place. They had these magic potions that they just threw on everybody and blood was gushing out of their mouth and their ears and he was, oh man, I wouldn't advise anyone to fight Americans. They are army from God. They made sure that they throw the propaganda out there so that the rest of the world would be scared. Oh my God, the Americans? Yeah, oh Lord. And then the so-called journalist who was interviewing the so-called bodyguard asked him, so would you advise anyone to ever fight Americans? And he said, oh, no, please don't never do that. They're an army from God himself. So they brought Maduro to New York to stand court. And the first problem began in court when they finally say, okay, show us proof that Maduro was a drug dealer. You say he was from a cartel name, whatever, Soles or whatever, right? The Justice Department responding that, they recognize that that cartel never really existed. But the Trump administration say, look, don't worry, we got the oil. That is what is more important. It's going to bring more jobs to Americans. So, we got the oils. And in fact, oil companies, right, they're begging to go in there now and spend billions of their own money, not the taxpayer money, their own money to rebuild Venezuela and to make money, right? So we got the oil. Don't worry about Maduro. He was a bad guy anyway. We delivered the Venezuelan people. They're going to make so much money. Even money itself will not understand how they made it, right? And so finally they sit down with oil executive and they began to talk about it. And Exxon CEO said, well, we've already been to Venezuela and there's nothing interesting over there. Trump administration like, what? How can you say this? So we did all of this for nothing? Look at all of that, man. We went and all these heroes and delivered Venezuela, and you say that we did this for nothing? All your executives are like, well, we had to tell you the truth. There's nothing special about Venezuela. We've already been there. We have companies there now. First of all, oil is cheap, right? And, we can't spend that much money in a country that is not really safe. Now the Trump administration is coming out and saying, well, look, we're going to have to spend the taxpayers' money in fixing the infrastructure so that the oil companies can go in there. Matter of fact, once, we finish spending, trust me, we're going to make so much money that we're going to give back to the taxpayers, and we may even send checks out, right? No, I added that last part. Because it's so funny, right? We see how the lies are adding up. The Trump administration spent all this money for 4 months, the taxpayers' money, sitting there, right, trying to surround Venezuela just to remove Maduro. That's it. We thought that they were going to remove the entire government, just Maduro. And even after doing all of that, the people who are taking power say, look, you're still not going to get it. You're not going to get that oil. It's still going to be difficult for you to fight. Look, I don't care much about, the government in Venezuela right now. I don't care because, they are traitors. But the very fact that now, with every single thing the U.S. did, they will get nothing out of it is exactly what they've been doing for years and is also exactly why the U.S. is in decline today. Every single country that you are going to count that they invaded is the same story. Iraq, they spent the taxpayers' money, and then every single time they got something out of it, it went to the 1%. It was never the American people. They never gave back the money that they spent in Iraq. They did the same thing in Libya. They did the same thing in Syria. It is always the same story. And now we see that in Venezuela. But I'm going to tell you what is even worse about this entire story for U.S. taxpayers, because it's the U.S. citizens who are suffering for this type of immature, evil process of the U.S. government. It is the taxpayer who are paying for it. The worst part about it is that not only that it's adding to the debt of the United States, but they have to borrow money from China to fund all of this activity. That's the sad thing. And even worse than that is that once they finish doing that, it is still China that will come benefit from it. I give you 6 months from now, it will go back exactly to what it was before the U.S. kidnapping of Maduro. Before that, you had China buying most of Venezuela's oil, although it was a small amount of just 4%. But it was the biggest buyer of Venezuela's oil. Now the U.S. went in there with weapons, armed. No, man, we don't want that. This is our backyard and all of that. And China just backed off and said, look, let's back off. Everybody insulted China. Oh, China is weak. Russia is weak. China said, that's fine. We'll take the insult. Let's see. And the warmonger, trigger happy, whether they're from the mainstream media or social media, came out there, oh yes, the US, they did it again. So for a movie, we've seen the movie. We appreciate how the movie was shot. It looked good. Yes, you went on and got Maduro very quick and, the Delta Force, and they came out there with black shades and guns and all of that. It looked good. Now let's see who's going to benefit from the money. China is laughing its way to the bank, while most of you warmongers are sitting down trying to give us a good fairy tale, right, which is a big lie about how you pull up the biggest operation of kidnapping anybody has ever pulled up. You still don't get it, right? It costs money for that, and the US does not have the money for it. It is China that is paying for it, okay? Because they're borrowing the money to do all of that exercise from China. And the worst part is that it is China that has the technology to go and buy Venezuela's oil and benefit from it. Big oil companies just said in the United States that they're not going to do anything special with that, right? The oil is so thick and heavy, and oil right now is cheap. And then the country is not really safe. Now we are talking about, an armed gang coming out trying to defend Maduro. How are they going to protect themselves in Venezuela? All of this movie before the end of January has already ended, right? It is already turning into a nightmare where the American people will have to pick up the tab. And when the revenue comes, the oil companies will be the one to make all of the money. So when you sit down and in your life, in the United States, you cannot afford health care. You cannot afford rent. Right? You are barely eating now. Right? Things are so bad. And you are standing tall saying, I'm proud to be an American because of the kidnap of a leader of another country. Because of military action. Because you're trigger happy. Because you're warmonger. When everything comes down, the question is, where would the money come to pay for all of that?